Millennials are doomed, and millennials are doomed for a couple of reasons. But if you're a millennial and right now you have a job, you have some savings, you have a place to live, it's kind of like you've made it to the final level of the game of life, because even though these things may sound or seem like just really basic essentials, if you have them right now, even though it may not seem like a lot, you're actually winning or doing really well. Now, millennials are royally screwed, no pun intended, but millennials are screwed and doomed because of a couple of reasons. And so the number one reason, or the first reason why millennials are screwed, is because of interest rates. So don't think about buying a new house or a new car or getting a loan or just about anything that requires borrowing money right now. And then the second thing is inflation. In 1925, my grandma could have bought a house for $4,000. And even though the house is only 500 square feet, that would have been her dream home and she could have paid $4,000 for it. But today, that same house is selling for $400,000. So it's like slowly over time, things have gotten more and more expensive. And then suddenly, within the last year, everything has gotten out of control and millennials just can't afford anything anymore. Now, the third reason millennials are doomed is because of house prices. And in 2019, my dream home would have cost around $380 or let's say $400,000, and today that very same house is going for around $750,000. Now, the fourth reason is national debt compared to the GDP, and then the fifth reason why millennials are doomed is because of their jobs. You either have a job where you are making enough money just 2 years ago, but now it's just not enough money anymore, or you don't have a job, and even if you do have a job, you're about to not have a job anymore, and you just don't know that you're not about to have a job anymore. Now, let's talk about each of these things for a while and break down why millennials are doomed. And so the first thing is interest rates, and interest rates go up and down, and it's kind of like normal. It's kind of like a part of the market cycle. But the main thing here is that if interest rates are low, then it's cheaper to borrow money. And if interest rates are high, then it's more expensive to borrow money. And yes, this means that if you go out here and you try to borrow some money right now, like getting a loan or some type of loan product, it's gonna cost you more than it would have before. However, the other side to this is that business that actually employs you, or the business that employs other millennials. So for example, back in 2020, when interest rates were lowered, it was really cheap to borrow money. And so businesses could take loans and they could use this money to do like advertising, research, development, and a bunch of stuff which could then essentially help them make more money. Now, this in turn gives you, the millennial, job security, or ensures that you keep getting paid and that you still have a job. But because interest rates are going up, these businesses are now unable to borrow money, or it's so expensive to borrow money that it probably just doesn't make sense anymore. And because of this, we could have an economic slowdown, and millennials could either start getting their hours cut, which has already started, or they could start losing their jobs and the businesses aren't doing as well as before. So things are slowing down at this business. They also don't have access to cheap debt, and this is where they look for other ways to cut costs, which is usually going to be jobs. Now, the next thing is home prices, and the situation right now is kind of unique, and we could blame like supply and demand and the cost of raw materials. But at the end of the day, houses are much more expensive than they were just 18 months ago, and they haven't just gone up by like 10%. There's some markets where houses have gone up by almost 200%. So you, the millennial who had a stable job, had some savings, and had a goal of purchasing a house, can no longer do so on the income that you had, that you thought was a good income, because you're being priced out of the market. So now you've got to worry about your job, and hopefully the company that you work for isn't being put in such a bad situation where they're either gonna fire you or you get your hours cut. And even if you can hold on to your job, you still can't afford a house with that same income. Now, the other thing was inflation, and this is the rate of which money loses its buying power. And this is nothing new because, like I mentioned before, in 1925, my grandma could have probably bought a house for $4,000. But today, that house is going to cost $400,000. So every year, the cost of goods get a bit more expensive. And even though you're making the same amount of money, or you have the same amount of money, you are only able to do less with that money. Now, inflation does have some pros to it. And one pro is that inflation is actually good for people who are borrowing. And so if you have like a loan, or you borrowed money for something like 2 years ago, then what you're currently paying for that money that you borrowed is going to be a lot less than compared to what you would be paying if you had borrowed that money right now. And now the main problem with this is that millennials are currently trying to get out of debt, and millennials are also trying to manage their money better and their personal finances. And so while inflation is good for the borrower, it's a really bad deal for the person that's actually saving money. So for instance, it's like me having an emergency fund in my savings account, and I don't really care too much about losing the purchasing power of my emergency fund because normally inflation is at like 2%. So it's not that big of a deal, but when it goes higher, then every single year, I'm gonna have to start adding more money, probably like a couple $100s or even a couple $1,000s to my emergency fund to kind of like balance it out to ensure that my emergency fund is still actually able to take care of me if I need it. So if the emergency fund was $10,000, you may have to add an additional $1,000 to it every couple of months because that emergency fund isn't able to take care of all your expenses for the same amount of time as when you first created it. Now, the same would be for you. If you have an emergency fund, or maybe you've been trying to save for like a down payment on a house, or you're saving to buy a car, or you're saving for just about anything in general, it's like you're moving backwards because the more you save, the more your money losing value, and it's happening very quickly. So you're kind of just screwed because even though you're trying to make your entire financial situation better, it just keeps getting worse. Now, the next thing was jobs or unemployment. And so a lot of millennials still have their jobs, but people are starting to get their hours cut. And there's like this lingering fear and uncertainty around because of interest rates going up, inflation, housing being unaffordable. And so people are slowing down their spending, or they're gonna be slowing down their spending, especially the millennials who are trying to make their personal finances a lot better. And so if you have less jobs or people are getting fired, they're getting their hours cut, then they're going to be spending less. And then we're going to end up with a slow economy, which could lead to a recession. Now, the next thing is the national debt compared to the GDP. And basically, this is like saying we have 30 trillion in debt, but we're producing 50 trillion per year. And in that case, then it's okay because if you think about it, you owe less than what you're currently producing, so it's fine. But if you're in debt and production is slowing down and people are losing their jobs and people are also not spending as much as they would normally, then eventually that GDP is going to go down and it's going to be less than your debt, and then we'll have a problem, and we're already seeing things slowing down. So the possibility is becoming a lot greater and greater every single month. So these are 5 reasons why millennials are doomed. And there's actually a 6th reason, and the 6th reason is this. If you're a millennial and you're watching this video, there's absolutely nothing that you can do about any of these reasons. For example, GDP going down, then guess what? There's nothing that you can actually do. I mean, at least not on your own. And then interest rates going up, then guess what? There's also nothing that you can do. Home prices are getting more expensive. That's also nothing that you can do. Inflation is going over 10%, then it's still something that you cannot control. So the main question is, if you're a millennial, how can you actually avoid being doomed? And honestly, you can't really change any of this stuff, so there's not much that you can do but to just adapt to everything that's changing around you. And so earlier on, I mentioned that if you had an emergency fund like me, you'd realize that inflation, because it's going so high so quickly, it's not at the normal 2%, you'd probably have to start adding money to your emergency fund. And so in my case, I already had my emergency fund 6 months worth of expenses. And this year I realized that even though I try to keep my expenses really low, I would need to add to my emergency fund because the amount that I have that I would need per month is actually higher than what it was last year. So now I have to bump my emergency fund up a bit because of inflation. And so if this continues into the next year, then guess what? Next year, I'm gonna have to bump my emergency fund up even more to account for it. Now, after doing that, I just wouldn't worry about inflation anymore because like I said before, this is not something that you or I can control. Instead, we just have to adapt to it and make the adjustments. Now, the same goes for like buying a house. If you were planning on buying a house and the prices are skyrocketing and you've been priced out of the market and you just can't afford it, then you've got to just sit on the sidelines and wait this out, or you could still buy, but you're not going to be buying the house that you wanted or the house that you were planning on buying. So instead, you just have to purchase whatever it is that you could currently afford. And so if your budget was $300,000, for example, before, and that $300K was going to get you a really nice brand new house, then maybe now $300K can only buy you like an old house that needs repairs. If that's what you can afford, then that's what you're going to have to do, or that's what you're going to have to buy. But it's just mainly 2 options. You either wait it out, or 2, you buy what you can afford, and then just don't worry about it because again, this is something that you cannot control. So point is, even though millennials are doomed, and by the way, I'm also a part of the millennial group, so I am doomed as well, but the point is this. you can't change any of this stuff, and there's really nothing that you can do apart from just adapting to whatever is happening around you. So with that said, comment down below, let me know if you're a millennial as well, and if you feel doomed because of everything getting out of your reach and getting so expensive. And with that said, all the best preparing, and I'll see you guys tomorrow.